Welcome to the Museum at FIT's Fashion Culture series. My name is Melissa Mara Alvarez, and I am MFIT's Curator of Education and Research. Tonight it is my honor to introduce Nancy J. Troy and Ann Marguerite Tartsinis, who will be in conversation with MFIT Curator of Costume and Accessories Colleen Hill about the book Mondrian Dress. They will discuss Yves Saint Laurent's widely popular 1965 Mondrian Dress series. They will explore the significance of these designs for the French couturier's career, their impact on Mondrian's posthumous reception, and how they resonate with the art of Roy Lichtenstein, Tom Wesselmann, and Andy Warhol. If you have any questions for our speakers, we ask you to please write them down, and we will be around to collect them towards the end of the program. After our conversation, Ms. Troy and Ms. Tartsinis will be available to sign books. I ask you now to please silence your devices and join me in welcoming tonight's speakers.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you to Anne and to Nancy. I'm really excited to talk about this incredibly fascinating book, which frankly I was more than thrilled to read, especially during office hours, which was amazing. And I want to start with a really simple question, which was what inspired a book based on a single collection in fashion, and how did you find such a rich narrative behind it?
Well, I'm going to start because for me, as a scholar of Mondrian's work, this topic began many, many, many years ago, but it had nothing to do with fashion. When I encountered Mondrian, it was strictly as a painter and as a theorist of, let's say, vanguard art of the early 20th century. And I had lots of different segues in my earlier career. So I wrote a dissertation about de Staël, and Mondrian was part of that. And later, having spent decades thinking about Mondrian, I also wrote a book about Mondrian, which was called The Afterlife of Piet Mondrian. And in that book, part of his afterlife was that he discovered Yves Saint Laurent, or actually, of course, the other way around. And it changed the way we think about Mondrian. And so I had worked a bit on this dress, or one or more of these dresses, but I didn't know very much about it. But I think we could see that there was a huge topic to be explored. And then I met Anne, who had other skills than I did and brought to the project something, very different. So it was a great collaboration. And she can maybe speak to her discovery.
Thank you. And thank you for having us, Colleen, and Tanya, and everyone else at FIT. I was really excited when, Nancy, as she said, was already working on this project, and I was really intrigued to your question, Colleen, about this kind of looking at this one dress as a catalyst for Yves Saint Laurent and his career, but also the way in which this dress, as we talk about in the book, kind of catapults Mondrian as well into the consciousness of the late 1960s, and thinking about what we know, and we can certainly talk about this, as the Mondrian dress is really many Mondrian dresses, and that became a really intriguing problem for me to think about, the way in which history has kind of celebrated the one dress that has the three colors on it, the primary colors, but there are so many others, and it was such an important collection for Yves Saint Laurent. So getting to dive into that was such a privilege and a pleasure.
And can you give us just a quick background in what Saint Laurent's influence was? Why did he do this collection?
It's a really great question, because Saint Laurent was very young when he in 1965 at his, probably for a Christmas gift, he was given a book about Mondrian. And it turns out, first of all, he had never seen a painting by Mondrian at that point. He encountered Mondrian as a reproduction in the books. So he's given this, a book by, the gift came from his mother, but it was the first monograph about Mondrian's work. So we know what the book was, and we know how powerful, actually, the color reproductions were. And this was the first occasion on which Yves Saint Laurent was inspired directly by paintings. And this is the first of many, many, many moments where he engaged with artists. But for Anne and me, it was very significant that it was actually through reproduction, because we felt as if this is kind of characteristic of some other figures who were also looking at Mondrian. And so as you look through these slides, you'll see works by pop artists who were also interested in Mondrian as a kind of an icon already of design. And they appropriated Mondrian not to make, obviously, something so much like Couture, but rather to present him as a kind of pop figure and as through the lens of reproduction, actually. So we thought, that's interesting that Saint Laurent shared that with them, perhaps inadvertently. So just one other point is that when Saint Laurent started to design when he did design these dresses, really, Mondrian was very much not well known in France at the time. So many people actually think that Saint Laurent is responsible for having introduced Mondrian to French audiences. He was much better known in New York, where he had lived for a few years, even though he had lived for many years in Paris during the 20s and 30s. But he wasn't well known there 20 years after he died. And so many people actually think that Yves Saint Laurent, and it makes some sense because his dresses, his interpretation of Mondrian became so powerful through the mechanisms we're looking at in the book, which maybe Anne can speak to a little bit more, that he kind of transformed the way we think about Mondrian. So if we think of Mondrian as a kind of austere, geometric, abstraction, and so on, he became something very different in the 1960s, both through the appropriation of pop artists, but especially Saint Laurent, because his work was so widely known and publicized.
Yes, thanks. I'll add that the book very much looks at this dress through many, kind of all the different valences and many different episodes, but it is a study of a single dress, which is remarkable, and we were surprised to find that, you know, to the degree at which we study it in this book, it hasn't been a subject. It's been a huge subject for Yves Saint Laurent surveys and exhibitions, but looking at it unto itself, it hasn't received the kind of explicit attention that we gave it in the book. And the idea of reproduction is really significant. There's an image that's, you know, kind of somewhere in this slideshow circulating on the screen from the Miami Herald, where you see the dress, the kind of 1965 couture dress, as it becomes reproduced and distilled through the fashion system at the time, and the way in which this idea very quickly, within weeks of its kind of issuing in Paris in August 1965, becomes a down market commodity. And that is part and parcel of how Mondrian became kind of recuperated and so famous again, also with the pop artists, but in the late 1960s.
And one of the things I think is so interesting about Saint Laurent's particular success with this collection is that he was not, in fact, the first designer to reference Mondrian in his work. And you have done so much amazing research in general, but I love some of the examples that you found of earlier styles. Could you talk a bit as to why you think Saint Laurent's particular Mondrian experience really hit this note in 1965 that earlier collections based on his work did not?
It's a fascinating, I mean, you can't even imagine that that could be a complicated question, you know, like, but there were other designers who, for example, one who went to the retrospective that the Museum of Modern Art organized in 1945, the year after Mondrian died. And she worked as Fox Brownie, Miss Brownie, and she said that she was looking at Mondrian dresses, but what she produced really didn't look a whole lot. I mean, it was geometric, but it was not red, yellow, and blue, and it was, nor was it like horizontal and vertical. So it seems like maybe she got from that geometry, something much more general or whatever. So I mean, this is in a way thinking about how Mondrian himself became the icon that he did. He circulated already before Yves Saint Laurent made these dresses in photographs, in some design. You know, he was well known, especially in the US. But what made Yves Saint Laurent's dresses so iconic, I think there are a lot of different things, so I'll say one or two, and I think Anne can say many more. So first of all, they come out of the couture fashion system. And the United States and the ways in which manufacturing and copying of French designs, or the appropriation of French designs to send it out to a much larger audience, was really happening in the US. So it's important that there were, or it's interesting, there were earlier designers, but none of them were connected to this gigantic system of couture and the ways in which couture was marketed and was kind of consumed, especially in the American market, especially in New York. But that's not why the dresses look so amazing. That's just part of, you know, a kind of structural answer.
I would add that there's so many different contributing factors to their success at this moment, and I know Colleen's written about this quite a bit with Paris Refashioned, which was a great book a couple years ago, but the Youthquake that was happening both in Britain and then certainly spreading across the globe. So this primacy of kind of youth culture that Yves Saint Laurent was trying to tap into, and certainly predates the opening of his own ready-to-wear line, Rive Gauche, and he was, the models for the August 1965 show were kind of intentionally supposed to look more youthful. What's kind of ironic to us from a contemporary perspective is that they don't look quite as youthful as, say, the models who are wearing Mary Quant in Britain, right? They're not kind of mini skirts and kind of really kind of bucking the system. Yves Saint Laurent at this very moment was towing a line between satisfying his couture clientele, which tend to be kind of older and more certainly wealthy, but also wanting to capitalize on the kind of youthful reckoning that was happening certainly in Europe and also in the United States. So it's interesting, but in fact, if you look at the dress, it's actually, the hem is quite long, it's just above the knee, and not many sold. It became incredibly popular, but we looked at the records at the Couture House, and there were a handful of models that were sold of the different variations of the Mondrian dress, but they were more successful for Yves Saint Laurent as what we call a brand icon rather than kind of necessarily financially successful. But as Nancy was just talking, his licensing contracts and his agreements with what might be called high-end department stores and kind of sanctioned copying really created this kind of proliferation of the Mondrian dress across the United States at the very least.
And one of the things I love is that you obviously found a lot of these amazing images that you've included in the book, but you also looked at quite a number of dresses, right? So you were really able to get into how they were made, and you make some really interesting points about their construction and how that actually allowed them to look like a painting, which I think helps to propel the couture legacy more so than the copies.
Absolutely. I'll take this one, Nancy.
Go for it.
So I was very lucky that the conservators and collection managers at the Metropolitan Museum, took the time to let me look at their number 81 dress, which again is the one with the three primary colors, and looking at it and kind of thinking about how it's been constructed. And it's these very finely tailored, mitered corners that kind of create these, the appearance of the rectangles on the body. And in fact, there's also padding kind of at the shoulders and above the clavicle to kind of further create this kind of flatness, so that when they're worn walking down the runway or walking down the street, they do, certainly on very specific body types, but they do look like paintings themselves in some way, even if that was never the intention.
So to add, there's a photograph in this loop of three models standing in front of at least one Mondrian painting. And it was the first exhibition of Mondrian's work held in Paris. And it didn't happen until 1969, so years after these dresses had been introduced and become very popular and all of that. But the Couture house sent three models to this exhibition. And they circulated in the exhibition. They have catalogs. They kind of twirl in front of a painting. So you know that it's sort of, they're somewhere between looking like they're looking at the paintings, but also presenting the dresses. And the man who wrote the book that Yves Saint Laurent had used as his source for the Mondrian paintings was there. He had been a friend of Mondrian's. And he was asked by some reporters, so what would Mondrian have thought about seeing these women wearing his paintings? So there was a whole, and many, many of the reviewers also, the critics for newspapers and women's wear and so on, the idea that what this looked like was people walking around in Mondrian's paintings. Even if Yves Saint Laurent did not like that analogy, many people used it. And what Michel Souffort, that author, said was, Mondrian loved beautiful women. He would have been thrilled to have these gorgeous women walking around in his paintings.
And since you just mentioned exhibition, in this case in paintings, but one of the things that really struck me about the way that you unpacked a lot of this complex material in your book was thinking about the collection itself, and I'll try to make this question as simple as I can, but I think what's so fascinating is that it's a collection in which a number of dresses were based on Mondrian paintings, but certainly not all, and even some of those that were based on the paintings, we wouldn't necessarily make that association as easily as we do with others. To what extent do you think that this almost misinformation about the complete collection has been informed by the way these pieces have been exhibited over time, if that makes any sense?
That makes sense. It's a great question. And it's very complicated. The number, as we articulate in the book, the number kind of changes over time as far as how many Mondrian dresses there were. And as Colleen was noting, there were many other kinds of dresses completely, detached from the kind of Mondrian idea that were in that collection. And of course, there's also the hot pink Mondrian dress, and there's no such thing as a hot pink Mondrian painting, unless I'm mistaken, Nancy. This is all part of the confusion around what is a Mondrian dress, which was part of why, at least for me, and I believe for Nancy as well, it was such an intriguing question to try to figure out in this book. And the installation, right there's the hot pink dress, very quickly. That was an installation from the Metropolitan Museum at the Yves Saint Laurent retrospective in 1983-84, which had this wall of so-called Mondrian dresses, wherein only a couple of them are ones that would now the Couture house would even call a Mondrian dress. And in fact, one was hung backwards, which took some sleuthing, but because I was like, I've never seen this dress. What is this dress? But Diana Vreeland decided to take some liberties and just turn it around.
Do you know why that was?
I don't.
It was the 81.
What was the 81? No, but why?
Oh, why that was?
Yeah.
It was because they owned one in their own collection already at the Met. They acquired that, I think, in 1969, so early. And then Yves Saint Laurent and the company, the Maison, lent one as well. So there were two. So she could do that. But you never see these things from behind, which is part of our discussion because they're presented as if they are flat. And, they flatten the woman's body and they look flat. And in many ways, we wanted actually to get beyond the conventional ways in which these have been presented, which is, see that painting? Doesn't it look like that dress? So then what? Because that doesn't, in some ways, as I'm sure this audience in particular knows so well, that doesn't get you very far. You get kind of to a similarity that's a formal similarity, and we wanted both to acknowledge that, then to ask this question, well, what is this bright pink dress doing in the middle? How did it get there? Why was it labeled a Mondrian dress? And, so I think one thing that I think Anne can speak to very well is the ways in which not only advertisements or whatever, but all of these magazines and really top fashion photographers who were hired to make photographs of these dresses made these things, so that the presentation in Vogue or in Harper's or whatever, not only at the Met, but much before that, actually, almost 20 years before, had a huge impact on everything that was shown on a given page. Maybe not everything was a Mondrian dress, but they all became Mondrian dresses by sort of association in some of those layouts.
Absolutely. It was striking to me that in a lot of the fashion photographs by David Bailey or Irving Penn, for example, it was always frontal. Again, back to this point that you never see the backs of the dresses. So it was always this frontal view. And very rarely do you see anyone kind of bending or moving in any way that would kind of disrupt this frontal planar quality of this dress. So they kind of self-perpetuated this idea of the dress as being equal to not self-perpetuated, excuse me, they perpetuated this idea of the dress as being equal to the painting or being like a painting because of that kind of formal rigidity that the dress required of the model and that the photographers at least tried to emulate with their compositions.
One further point. I think these things, obviously, we think these are fascinating, and we think, are our ideal audience, because maybe you'll think they're fascinating too. But in any case, one thing to understand is that in the program, so there were 106 ensembles or items presented in the collection. And one of the things that intrigued us is that Mondrian's name is not in the program, the printed program that went along with the presentation. So that in a certain way, it's not that Saint Laurent was hiding that. It's just that, first of all, he didn't foreground it. And I think in some other early collections, there also is no mention of the artists that inspired him. But I thought that's really amazing. So where did the Mondrian moniker come from that was so quickly applied to these dresses? And the answer, we think, is that it was published in reviews of the collection. Yves Saint Laurent also gave some interviews and mentioned that his mother had given him this book. So he wasn't hiding it, but it also wasn't something that necessarily they claimed. So one thing you might think about is that maybe it became important also to him and his business partner and who was also his lover, Pierre Berger, because it was so focused on in the press. So it's a dynamic relation with these photographs and reviews and so forth. And that's just really fascinating, or it was fascinating to us. How did this name get attached? How did the style get attached? And why was that name attached to all sorts of dresses that weren't in that style?
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because a number of years ago when I was working on an exhibition on 1960s French fashion, I had for so long taken this collection and this Mondrian moniker for granted. I just thought that's what the collection was called. So I think in many ways you're kind of breaking down this fashion history lore and teaching us that it is not in fact that straightforward. And it might have even been on Saint Laurent's own website, the brand site, that had a little timeline, and it said the collection wasn't actually called this. And I was like, really? I had no idea. And I also kind of assumed that everything looked like a Mondrian dress, and of course we've shown that that's not the case. So it really is such a fascinating idea. I'd also love to hear a little bit more about these copies, because one of the things I had not heard anything about until reading your book was, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Mondrian's estate was not so pleased about these dresses when they first came out. Is that correct?
Maybe Anne could just say something about the copies, and then I'll speak to the estate, because that came in a little later.
Well, the copies, as I mentioned, there were these copies that were created for department stores in the United States and elsewhere. And so there's part of the licensing that they would send kind of couture examples. This is one way this would happen to, for example, Magnons in San Francisco and Los Angeles, who had a couture atelier and would kind of take one apart and figure out how it's made and then make iterations of that for their clients at a lower price point. There is an example at LACMA where you can actually see along the side seams, you know, that kind of lovely kind of parallel line of dotted lines that suggests there was a previous seam there, right, that was ripped apart. So you can tell that these have been taken apart and thought about, and that was in fact donated by Magnon to LACMA. So it was part of this larger kind of circulation and set of procedures that were very profitable for couture houses like Yves Saint Laurent. Of course, Alexander Palmer has done a lot of work on Dior on this subject. But the copies, as far as the estate goes, is something the Mondrian scholar can speak to.
So Mondrian had no children. He died during the war, and he had relatives who were in South Africa and also in Holland, but you can imagine communication was very difficult. So not only that, but there was an American artist named Harry Holtzman who brought Mondrian to the US from England, where he had left France in knowing that the war was imminent. He went to London, and in 1940 he came to New York. So he lived in the city for 3.5 years, and this artist, Harry Holtzman, was very instrumental in bringing Mondrian to the States. Complicated man who inherited, as a result of that, Mondrian made him his sole heir, and he inherited whatever was in the studio. And that's a very complicated, it's not complicated, but it's a fascinating story. But Harry, eventually he had sold what was in the estate, and he looked around for like, where else am I going to get some money from? And, but he was not all that careful with the record keeping. So when he realized that Saint Laurent, or somebody must have told him that Saint Laurent had made these dresses without permission from the estate. And I think he would have loved to have sued him, which that's a whole other question, whether you actually think making dresses that are based on paintings or whatever, whether there would have been a copyright issue. But he never wanted to spend the money to pay a lawyer to sue, so he never did that. He just complained about it. But Saint Laurent never asked. But by the same token, I think maybe also, Lichtenstein didn't, so within the visual arts, the whole idea of appropriation, there wasn't a movement called that yet, but the whole idea of borrowing or influence or whatever is embedded in modern art. And certainly these pop artists appropriated Mondrian, and nobody asked Harry Holtzman if that was okay.
And on the topic of pop art, this is, of course, not the first or only time that Saint Laurent is influenced by artwork, but can you talk about his role within the pop art world from this point in 1965 forward, particularly with future collections like based on Tom Wesselmann's work, what the reception to those collections were versus the Mondrian collection, just a little bit more general context maybe about Saint Laurent's role within the pop art world, which he really forged for himself.
I'll just say one thing about Mondrian there. Saint Laurent understood that this dress was A, popular, and B, youthful. And he went, at the time, in the fall of 1965, he was already planning to open the Yves Saint Laurent Rive Gauche. And he said, he's quoted as saying, that he really thought his Mondrian's dresses would circulate in this area of students and the left bank that was, it was different from the right bank couture kind of audience, younger and less expensive. And he thought of his own Mondrian dresses as proliferating among that audience. And that's interesting because for many years, he did not make a Mondrian dress, and they weren't sold in Yves Saint Laurent Rive Gauche. Another example much later was, but during that period, he saw them as pop or youthful and popular. And that's interesting because he never actually, there's a slight disconnect because also his pop art line of the following year was a couture line. So this high, low, elite, popular is a kind of complex set of questions for him.
I would add his relationship to pop art was part of the brand identity at this point. There's this great article in Women's Wear Daily by Carol Bjorkman where she's purportedly chasing him around Paris on a motorcycle as he goes to this gallery and that gallery, and is that a Warhol in the window? And it's just, there's all these kind of name dropping of pop artists and of kind of elite kind of art world signifiers that is supposed to be part of Yves Saint Laurent's kind of identity as a couturier, which is something that becomes almost essential to his brand identity going forward. And certainly there's been numerous kind of collections that are based on other kind of quote-unquote modern masters, like Picasso, for example. And certainly in 2022, there was an exhibition across Paris, Yves Saint Laurent au Musées, which kind of put his dresses alongside a number of the artworks that he had found inspiration in, over the many decades of his career. But in this moment in 1966, kind of he was already, purportedly friendly with Andy Warhol. They bought a flowers painting even before the pop art collection came out in 1966. And so there wasn't a huge collection of pop art, but there were a couple discrete instances where he was, not just collecting, but associating with Andy Warhol, especially. He would come to New York and go clubbing with Andy Warhol, and there's a kind of great movie that was, or a short film that was taken of him seeing his own Andy Warhol portrait for the first time, where he becomes kind of bashful, and he's so grateful to Andy Warhol, and then Mick Jagger walks in the room. So, it's all part and parcel of his own, or at least this is the way I read it, the way we read it, part and parcel of his own identity as a couturier, but as a couturier as an artist as well, right? Kind of really blurring those boundaries, which have been done certainly with other figures as well. But
fascinating. And I have one last question, and I hope you don't mind if I take your term, but what is the afterlife of this dress? How has it continued to perpetuate in our fashion lexicon?
Wow, I think you're better at answering that than me. I think many people. So first of all, there are designers in Holland, and we write about this at the end of the book to show that there are still people designing Mondrian dresses and other Mondrian items. There have been exhibitions in museums of Mondrian-inspired fashions, both from the 80s, across the spectrum from, I guess those are Couture, to very popular things. And in Holland in particular, so this is something that I like very much, maybe Anne can say what she likes, especially about the Afterlife, but recently there was an exhibition that celebrated the 100th year of De Stijl. So that was the movement that Mondrian was involved in helping to found in Holland. And as part of that, there was an exhibition of all of Mondrian's paintings, hundreds of them, owned by a museum in The Hague. And that museum has also collected Saint Laurent and other Mondrian-inspired clothes by a variety of people. And in this exhibition, or an adjunct to it, they invited people who had made Mondrian sweaters, knitted them, to bring them into the museum. They photographed these people and they interviewed them. And it wasn't only the people who made them, but many people it had been made by my wife, or it was made by my cousin, or whatever. But they were all proudly wearing their Mondrian items. And it wasn't like these were going to become part of the museum, but it sort of really drove home to me anyway, this emotional connection to the artist, at least in Holland, and through the Mondrian dress. This would not have happened without a Mondrian dress made by Saint Laurent, and then this whole legacy of other people who had designed in that, kind of context over decades. And here are these people who, want to identify with that and they can wear their own Mondrians. It was actually quite moving, and very, very different, for example, than seeing Saint Laurent's iconic Mondrian dress in the Centre Pompidou in Paris next to a Mondrian painting. It's in a certain way, the opposite idea of the relationship, because it did happen in an art museum. It just wasn't about who's the high artist and who's the popular. Anyway, I found it fascinating. So,
I'll just add, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Nancy, it was Benno Temple who called the Mondrian dress the mother of all Mondrian merchandise. And that's very much the case. Now, obviously, these personal sweaters are kind of a bit idiosyncratic within that. But thinking about the afterlife of the Mondrian dress for Yves Saint Laurent, it's something that he revisited for Rive Gauche in 1997, I believe. He also made a suit in the late 80s, and then, of course, kind of remade the dresses for his kind of final retrospective, or a final retrospective in 2002. And these dresses now, if you see a red, white, and blue dress with black bars on it, it inevitably gets associated with Mondrian, even if those bars are diagonal or if there's a circle on it. And so it's really, just like Benno Temple said, it kind of birthed these like endless iterations of primary colors and black bars that have nothing to do with the paintings.
Thank you so much. This has been fascinating. We have a few questions from the audience, if you don't mind. Did you find any information on how much the dresses cost and how long it might take to make one of the couture examples? I get a lot of these questions about costs. It's hard to answer. I'm sorry. Sometimes we can find it, often not, but maybe you found it.
We know, and it's written in the book, and I believe it was about $1,800, is that right? for a Couture original. And then, in fact, there's also, we have these great photographs of tags of the copies. So the original is 1800, but then the copy is 600, or roughly.
So if you
thereabouts.
look at the Miami Herald, there are 4 images across that page of the newspaper, and the top one is the original, and then by something like, that was introduced August 2nd, and by something like October 6th, they are saying it's available for like $3.99.
And this was 1965 prices.
Yes.
So if
but
you
I mean,
go
it
to
was,
inflation
it's
calculator.
proliferated. That's this image. Sorry.
Yes. Yeah.
So we did know that, but thinking about how long it took to make them, I mean, it is amazing what goes on in a couture house. They can make these couture dresses very quickly.
Yeah,
seems to
especially
me.
this style. Sure. Yeah.
So I don't think it took very long, exactly, which doesn't take away from the tremendous skill and kind of perfection of dressmaking that they exemplify.
Right. Yeah, it really is that skill that allows them to do it more quickly than we might imagine. Can you speak more about the pop artists' interest in Mondrian? Someone noted that some of the fine art examples, if you will, predate the collection. So can you talk more about where that was coming from?
So as we write about in the book, and Nancy already started to mention this earlier, that the pop artists, for example, Roy Lichtenstein and the Wesselmann that we've had in the slideshow, were kind of early appropriators of the Mondrian in reproduction, in the case of Wesselmann, but also in the case of Lichtenstein, that kind of recreated Mondrian in his own signature language with the Ben-Day dots. So that has certainly happened earlier. And then, it's interesting to think about Andy Warhol and the way in which Campbell Soup Company appropriated his style for their paper dresses, which were very gridded and shift-like, which is something we talk about in relationship to the Mondrian dress as well. So there's a significant amount of kind of build-up to Yves Saint Laurent's design as far as appropriation goes.
So we aren't suggesting that the influence, if that's the right word, or the engagement goes in one direction or another. It's more web-like or network-like. And so what's interesting about these pop artists is that they were interested in this iconic the image of Mondrian became something that, as Benno Temple said, so the Mondrian dress was, let's say, the biggest, the most powerful means of proliferating Mondrian's design, paintings as design. So the question of what these pop artists, we try to write about it in a sensitive way, that it's more than just the image of Mondrian. They were interested at that time, like Saint Laurent, or in some ways like that, in this kind of dialectic of originality and reproduction, and that they themselves come to the Mondrian design, for example, with Ben-Day dots like Lichtenstein, or other kinds of commodities that Wesselmann puts on the kitchen table. So I think it's true, as this person remarks, that they preceded, but they really all participate in the same kind of set of brand iconic kind of qualities that Mondrian represented, and they all want to investigate those kind of qualities in their own work. So they share that rather than having it be a one-way influence. And it's really important to understand, for example, and many people did not know this, that Yves Saint Laurent, who together with his partner, owned 5 works by Mondrian, 3 of which were abstract paintings and 2 were landscape scenes. Those were all bought after the dresses were made. They were bought in the 1970s and later. And so many people thought, oh, he's an incredible collector, and he looked at the art that he had on the wall in the living room kind of thing. But I don't think, it was not that. So it's good to keep in mind, because I think these things are, more, I'm not trying to say it's amorphous, but it's more interesting than a one-way set of influences might be.
And I wanted to mention this earlier, but I loved your point that both the paintings and the dress, even though they overall have this simple geometric look, they actually do inspire closer looking. So I love the idea of Saint Laurent getting these paintings and being able to engage with them regularly because they're his, and like really getting something from that he hadn't previously, perhaps. Okay, so our last question. Do you think that the flattening of the body is a reference to Mondrian's early inspiration of windmills or their blades? Have you thought about that connection at all?
Shall I answer that? Or you wanna
Sure.
answer?
I personally haven't made that connection. It's a very interesting question.
Yeah. I think it's unlikely because they wouldn't have known. I mean, I think that's probably not the case. However, if you want to go look at the history of Mondrian's work and the evolution of his work from landscape and figural and architecture, architecture is extremely important in his immediately pre-abstract work. So for Mondrian, potentially yes, but probably not for the dresses themselves.
Well, thank you both so much. I learned a lot. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
And don't forget, there's also a book signing. I can really attest to the fabulousness of the book.